A reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The word of the Lord.
If the product is free, then you are the product. If the product is free, then you are the product. I heard someone say this past week, essentially saying as to why you get so many spam calls and texts and emails is because every time you've signed up for free Wi-Fi somewhere, you thought you were getting a product for free, when it turns out that you and your information, you are the product. People are buying your information and then they're selling it all over the place. It's a similar idea as to there's no such thing as a free what? Free lunch. Except for at church next Sunday. Actually, that is a real free lunch. And when I heard that, I was just reminded as to how transactional and how everything about our world today, that there's something going on underneath the surface, that everybody just wants something from you. And of course, I don't have to tell you that living here in New York City, we are suspicious of anyone who is being nice or offering anything for free. And on the one hand, when you hear that, or when I heard that this past week, I thought, well, of course, that's just the way things are. And, you got to guard yourself, or you do the same thing to other people. And so you just tend to accept that that's sort of the thing that's always happening, while also, taking advantage and living into it yourself. But then on another hand, I just thought, that makes me so sad. That makes me so sad that our relationships, that our community with one another is always reduced down to a very transactional level. And it's always, what can you do for me? There's got to be a better way than to live into that kind of a mentality. Well, friends, that is why we're looking at the Gospel of Mark, and we're looking at the way of Jesus. Because we want to be a community that is not living in the same way that the world lives, living out the same value systems as this world that just wants to take from one another. But we want to live into a better way together as a community. That is the way of Jesus, living not for ourselves, but for the good of Brooklyn. But as you've seen over the past several weeks, when you looked at Mark's case for who Jesus is as the Messiah, Jesus' way, though it might be better, is definitely not easier. It is hard to live in a countercultural, life-giving way compared to the life of this world. And that's why we're going to look at who Jesus is and how he might change us to be a kind of community for not for ourselves, but for the good of Brooklyn. In our passage today from Mark chapter 10 is sort of the summary statement line of all of Jesus' ministries. This is the driving point that Mark is wanting to get to all along when he says that the Messiah has come not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And when he says that, Jesus is making very clear that he is unlike any other religious leader that comes just to be a mere example of how you should live. But he's saying, I am a king, I am a religious leader, I'm a founder of a new way of life that has not come to be an example for you, but has come to serve you. And to serve you by way of dying for you as a ransom for many. That is what sets Christianity apart from any other world religion, but also what sparks an entirely new radical community for Jesus' followers. That's what we're going to look at today. Jesus and what he has done for us, for the church, can actually empower us to live our lives not for ourselves, not prioritizing ourselves, but to live the way that Jesus does with these upside down kingdom values that looks not to be served, but to serve others. But that's clearly very, very hard. And so we're going to look at why is that hard as well as how we can do that. So by looking at our passage, by these disciples that are squabbling together and getting mad at one another, let's look at three things today. First, let's see our desire, our insatiable desire to be an insider. Then we'll look at Jesus' call to be an outsider. And then finally, where it is that we can get the power to live that way. So the desire to be an insider, the call to be an outsider, and where we get the power to live that way. So first, when you read this passage, you're kind of reminded something that we can often forget. When we read or we think about the disciples, the 12 followers of Jesus, we can often think that they were these super disciples that lived beautiful, wonderful lives, right? Because they're so prominent in the gospel narratives. But passages like this just remind you that the disciples themselves were a hot mess. They're much more like us, not living the way that Jesus has called them to live, especially when they are in community with one another. Here's what, starting in verse 35, says this. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, they came to Jesus and they say, Teacher, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. And then we read later that the disciples start to get indignant. They get very, very angry at James and John that are asking of this. Because why? What is it that James and John are asking of Jesus? Well, remember, there was this expectation that Jesus was the Messiah. Right? He was going to come and inaugurate a new kingdom and ascend to his throne of glory. He's going to start a new regime. And now the disciples at this point, they've been walking with him for the past several years. And so you can start to imagine that they are sizing one another up. Competition is starting to brew like any other community that we've ever been a part of. If you remember last week, Peter, he says, Lord, what will we have? We have left everything to follow you. What will we have in the coming age? Right? Remember Peter says that? And in a subtle way, Peter is kind of making his own case to be the top disciple. And so what is James and John doing? They're doing a similar thing. Everyone is now starting to jockey for position next to and closest to Jesus when he brings about his kingdom. And so James and John, they're making this really shrewd, bold, political move against the other disciples. Now, this doesn't sound just like the Game of Thrones. It sounds like just our everyday lives here in New York City, right? The reason why this sounds so familiar is because it hits at this core human nature that we all live into all the time, especially here in this city. And that is this deep, deep desire to be approved of, to be looked at as someone who is important, to have status and power, to be closest to those who are very, very important, right? And in a lot of ways, some of our greatest fears here in the city is to be left out from those circles, to not have those places of honor. And that's what drives us to prioritize ourselves, our place, our status, and to first be concerned with what about me? Right? This is, sort of very reminiscent to what the thinker from the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, talks about. Right? We've inherited in our culture today a lot of what he has been talking about and writing about back in the 19th century, where he essentially says that people do not live out of love and respect for one another in community, but underneath all of these little relationships, underneath it all, that there is this deep drive and this struggle for influence, recognition, and ultimately power. That's what Friedrich Nietzsche says. In some ways, that's sort of a description of New York City and probably some of your workplaces. That underneath it all, at the heart of community, is ultimately a battlefield for status. And it's all about climbing up the social hierarchy, one-upping each other, to get to a place where you have more than somebody else. And therefore, it makes community a place that is all about you. what you get and who you are in that community. Now, that sounds really harsh, and I know that you're probably thinking, well, no, I don't live that way. Of course I love and honor other people. I think today, Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the only ones that were honest enough to call that out so starkly. Today, we just hide it better. Instead of us wanting to step over one another deliberately and intentionally to get a higher status, I think what better describes how we live into this narrative is that we have this desire to be an insider. C.S. Lewis has this great article called The Inner Ring. And he says in this article, he talks about how in our self-interest, we're driven by this desire to be an insider in whatever local ring, in whatever community that we are a part of. And that we live also with the terror of being left outside of any of those kind of local inner rings. And so he says we crave being in the inner ring where we can have the delicious knowledge that we 4 or 5, all huddled beside the stove, are the people who know. I love that he says that we desire this delicious knowledge that we, the special few, huddled together here in this inner ring, we are the ones who really know. And I know we felt that in every single community that we have been a part of, whether it's on the playground or in the boardroom. There is something else going on. There is this striving to be on the inside, in the know. And of course, that's sort of how our city operates all the time. It's all about position and status in relation to one another. And the thing that C.S. Lewis highlights about this, it's not just about our desire to be in. It is all about who is out. Here's what he says. Your genuine inner ring exists for exclusion. There'd be no fun if there were no outsiders. The invisible line would have no meaning unless most people were on the wrong side of it. Exclusion is no accident, it is the essence. And that is why our city thrives on exclusion, on exclusivity, on status. That's why we love special access to things and knowing people that others don't, to get treated with exclusive status. We love that. We crave that because there is this delicious knowledge that we are the ones on the inside. And here's the thing, it's not just out there in the streets. Communities just like this in the life of the church can absolutely be driven by this desire to be on the inside. That when you walk out to coffee hour and you see all the people around, you're honing in for what inner circle can I be a part of? And here's the thing, here's what C.S. Lewis says. He says that you don't actually have to even be the one on the inside, whether by pining or moping outside of the rings that you can't ever enter, or by triumphantly passing through further and further in, you still are an inner ringer. You are still driven by the desire to be on the inside. And you might be thinking, why is that so harmful? Well, who cares, right? That's how everybody is wired. Here's the reason why that is so harmful, especially for a community. It is because when we desire that, it means that your sense of importance and status is always, by definition, coming at the cost of other people. The inner rings make you feel important in comparison to others. And that is exactly what the disciples are squabbling over, right? And that is the thing that is destroying their inner community. That's what's turning this group of disciples into a battlefield for status. Because they had this desire to be on the inside, closest to those who are important, those with status. And that is the thing that can absolutely kill community. You make it all about you instead of others. I think a great example of this is in my favorite musical of all time. I watch it like 4 times a year on Disney+. That's Hamilton. And Hamilton, anyone from Hamilton here? No, okay, sorry. I heard a woo and I was like, oh, is somebody here? The character that most exemplifies that is Aaron Burr, right? He has this great song that he sings that he wants to be in the room where it happens. The room where it happens, right? He is so caught up in not just having a position, but just being in that inner room where all of the decisions are made. And of course, Alexander Hamilton is in that room. And that drives Aaron Burr to so much jealousy and anger toward Hamilton that ultimately, spoiler alert, they end up having a duel and he's the one who kills Hamilton. It's in the first 10 seconds of the play, so it's not really a spoiler, actually. Right? It's his desire to be in those places at the cost of other people that can drive you to seek the end of another person in favor of a position. See, when we are gripped by the allure of self-promotion, there is no end to what we could possibly do to other people. This desire can be in us, even though it feels and looks tame. So a question for us this morning is, how is it that you view yourself, your status, your importance, your prominence? What makes you feel good about yourself and your own view? Is it being in those inner rings? And therefore, what is your view of other people? Are they a means to an end? Are they something to get out of? Are they someone to please so that you can get into the right circles? How are you viewing others? These small, subtle questions can be the seeds of something that can grow into something so ugly and not the way of Jesus. And that is our second point, that Jesus, he says, not so with you. Look with me on starting in verse 43. Jesus says this. When he sees them squabbling, he brings them together. And he says, the rulers, the Gentiles, everybody else lives this way, but not so with you. Instead, Jesus says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Now, if you read the Bible, you read things like this all the time, and we can tame it. We can water it down. But realize what Jesus is saying when he says something like this. He is saying now, power and status is no longer what drives you in my kingdom. You are now to have a complete reorientation of the self that doesn't seek to be on the inside, but looks to be on the outside as someone who serves in love. That what makes you great in my kingdom, not in the kingdoms of the world, but in my kingdom, is not being an insider, not being the CEO, not being the one with the resumes, not being the one with all the power and the status and the influence, but being one of the most looked down on, lowest positions in all of society. And to get that crazy point across, he uses two particular words to tell us who is the greatest in his kingdom: servants and slaves. Servant comes from the word diakonos. That's where we get our word for the diaconate. Later on, as a community, we'll be talking a little bit more about what the diaconate does. But a servant, diakonos, is someone who takes care of others. It is someone who is principally, their identity is to help and serve others. It is not to be the master and the owner of the house that gets to make all these great, high, big decisions. But it's someone who doesn't even live in the house, who's on the outside, whose main job it is to serve others. That's what a servant did in society. And of course, that was therefore someone who was lowest on the ring of who was deemed worthy or popular on the inside. But then secondly, it says also you are to be, if you want to be first in the kingdom, you have to be a slave to all. That word slave comes from the word doulos. And that was simply, in these times, simply someone who was not free to do whatever they wanted. They were bound to obey a master. It was someone whose life was not their own. They didn't even have their own rights. But someone who was bound to serve. And of course, with the lowest amount of rights, bound to serve meant that they were lowest on the totem pole of status in all of first century culture. These are people who nobody wanted to be like. Slaves and servants are the furthest from the innermost rings of society. And Jesus says, that is who you must be. That is who is the greatest in my kingdom. It is a complete redefinition. But here's the thing that I want us to see. It is not just to take a lower status of oneself just for its own sake. It is not just to become unimportant just because that's a value that Jesus has. No, the reason why he says that is because these people are primarily ones who identify with serving other people. He is not saying, he's saying, do not take power and control to get your way, but he's also not saying get completely out of the way and become unimportant. The reason why he brings up these particular two people is that he is saying you are to principally now seek to love other people through serving them. See, the service service is meant to serve the love. That is what is being principally upheld here. In other words, he's saying, use your power in order to serve and love other people rather than to serve and love yourself. Use your power in order to serve and love other people rather than to serve and love yourself. Now that sounds nice, but I really want us to see how radical that is and how extremely difficult that is when you really understand the call that Jesus is asking to be an outsider. And these are things that are just all over Scripture. You just can't get away from it. If you believe in a Christianity that does not include this, it is not Christianity. And that is also why messing around with Jesus can flip your whole life upside down. Jesus is not safe. He's not here to give you just a better, more comfortable life. He's very, very dangerous. He can change your entire value system, make you live in an upside down kingdom compared to the values of this world. Because this is an incredibly difficult call. He is saying that now your fundamental posture toward others is to be one of a servant and a slave, to have a nature about you that now seeks to serve rather than to be served. And he's not saying only when you feel like it, to the people that you like, to your family. Of course we can do that. The rest of the world, Jesus says, can do that, can love and serve the people that we like or when we feel like it. But he instead is saying that your primary identity is to now constantly and deliberately take a lower place for yourself in order to prioritize others for the sake of love. This is the call to starve out our human desire for approval, our human craving, our fleshly craving for status, to die to yourself, to crave something entirely different. Because to be great in Jesus' kingdom is now to crave serving other people for the sake of love. That is what Jesus' kingdom is all about. And we have to get really clear to this point that we can't water this down. We have to really swallow this whole. Because throughout history, the church and Christians in particular love trying to gain status and power. And when that happens, good things do not happen. And Jesus is saying unequivocally that you are now not to try to take power and influence and control through influence. That the church is not to take political power to try to protect itself or to grow itself. Jesus says, that is not my way. That is never how I grow my kingdom. And therefore, that is never how the church is meant to act. It is never through dominance that my kingdom moves forward. It is through sacrificial love. That is real Christianity. And that is why real Christianity only flourishes when it's out on the margins, when you're squeezed, when you are the ones that don't have power, not at the seat of power, at the center of culture, trying to change the world. No, it is only when you take the posture of an outsider that principally seeks to love. That is when you will give your life sacrificially, and the rest of the world will look at you and take notice. Jesus says, that is how my kingdom is to progress and move forward. To live a life not for yourself, but for the good of others. Because if you don't live like that, everyone will say, well, Jesus' kingdom is just like the rest of the world's, just like the Gentiles who use and abuse their power and their authority, and they lord it over other people. Jesus says, that's not who I am. That's not why I came. I came to lay my life down to be a ransom for many, to give my life, to sacrifice myself so that others might have life. Don't you dare use my name to take power and control and influence. Well, where do we get the power then to serve and to live like that? Because friends, if we're communicating this correctly, you need to see this isn't an impossibility. It is very, very hard to truly live unselfish lives for the sake of another. Because here's what different worldview says. The Nietzschean view that our city typically lives in says, sure, you can love and sacrifice for other people, but you're doing it so that you can ultimately secure power over them. which is why Nietzsche and others who follow that view were always suspicious of people who are so nice, suspicious of those who are serving, because he's saying, well, that's really a way to get what you really want, right? Or moralism, whether it's religious moralism or secular moralism, says, well, you ought to live this way and serve other people because that's what will make you accepted by culture and make you be seen as a good person. Or in religious moralism, that's what will make you be accepted by God, and then you'll get to go to heaven. So that's why we should live an unselfish life, and that's why we should serve. Or there's more literature coming out that the path toward happiness, right, is not to live a life that prioritizes yourself, but to live and serve and to give of yourself. That if you live in a way that serves others, then you'll be most happy. But you got to see in every single one of those views, what are you ultimately still serving? Yourself. See, all views say that you lead an unselfish life so that you ultimately benefit from it, that you either gain influence or that you feel like a good person, right? Or that you can go to heaven, or you do it so that you ultimately have a happier life. At the end of the day, it is still all for you and not truly out of service for the sake of love. And friends, the only way that we can have the power to really live this way is if you see the gospel and what Jesus has done for you. Only the gospel can really empower you to true service for the sake of others out of beauty, out of love, not just duty. Look at what Jesus says to James and John when they ask to be seated at the left and the right of his kingdom. Jesus says this in verse 38. You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? And can you be baptized in the baptism that I'm going to be baptized in? And of course, in their complete foolishness and their complete arrogance, as they are blinded by the power and the status that they could have, they say, yes, we can. And Jesus, he's thinking to himself, you have no idea what my kingdom is really about. You have no idea what I came to do. You have no idea what it means truly to be great. Because in this moment when Jesus is witnessing his disciples that he's been forming for over 3 years, squabbling over their status and their position, Jesus, he's heartbroken because he knows that in just a few days, in just a mere few days, he is going to go to the center of the religious center in Jerusalem to give up his life as a ransom for many, when he will, not in the world's view, but in God's kingdom's view, be inaugurated in glory. But it's not the kind of glory that they are ever thinking, because he's about to be crucified on a cross. And when he is, the people to the left and the right of him will not be his disciples who have all scattered and betrayed him at this point. There will be other criminals dying a death judged by God. Jesus says that is who is going to be on the side and the left and the right of me, because that is how I'm going to bring about my kingdom. I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to give my life as a ransom for the worst of sinners, and I'm going to therefore drink the cup, the full wrath of God for your selfish lives. I'm going to take that on. I'm going to be plunged in your sin, so that now if you look to me and my life that I've given for you, you will now have life that you never deserved. That is what my kingdom is all about. I'm going to come and take your place, he says, because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' entire life, his entire mission was one of complete selfless love, an unselfish life. He says to the disciples and to us that I live for you, truly on your behalf. There is nothing else that Jesus is getting out of this. He's saying, I'm coming to serve you in complete love at great cost to myself. And if you, friends, if you personally experience the gospel, if you personally experience what Jesus has come to do, to giving his life for you, that the ultimate insider who had everything in fellowship with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, for your sake, becomes the ultimate outsider, the lowest in society, that he comes to be a slave and a servant for you. When you experience that kind of love, that now has the power, my friends, to shoot you out into a life that can really live unselfishly, not for yourself, because you see that you now have everything in what Jesus has done for you. If the God of the universe is willing to give his entire life for you, what will he hold back from you? And if he's willing to go that far to have you, a love that you can never lose, a status that was never yours to begin with, once you have that approval, you don't have to be on any inner rings or any inner circles ever again. You don't have to look to prioritize your own status and your own comfort and your own life and your own position, because you have Jesus's. That's what he gives to you on the cross. And only if you have that kind of a love, it can set you out. It can make us a kind of community where others look and say, why do you live this way? Why do you love and serve us even though you get no benefit from it? And we'll say, because of what Jesus has done for us, that is the kingdom that we are a part of. That is what we want others to see. Friends, the gospel can really give you and us the power to live beautiful, upside-down kingdom values that the world is desperate for. Let me pray for us.